Mitch Lawrence, Sirius XM NBA Radio. Pete Thompson, James Harden got paid.
Big time.
Yeah.
He got paid. It isn't just here's $1. I mean, come on.
Get out of here, kid.
Bank. Buku bucks.
Mitch Lawrence, Sirius XM NBA Radio. The free agent winners and losers. The winner may surprise you here. The biggest move in free agency this offseason. We'll get into kind of an overview of, 2 weeks, Pete, now that have been pretty crazy. Not as much money, really, as last year, but some trades. We've seen really some interesting storylines. Interested to see how the shape of the league has changed in Mitch's view. Mitch, we've kind of all come to the realization that it's the Warriors and everybody else. But is there at least more teams intriguing this year as opposed to last year where it seemed it was Golden State, Cleveland, San Antonio, and that was about it. Is the 2017-2018, is there more intrigue? Even though we think the Warriors are a heavy favorite, is there at least more intrigue?
Oh, definitely. And it's really out in the West more than the East. I mean, Minnesota, what they did, bringing in Jimmy Butler and Taj Gibson, a couple of guys who played for Thibodeau in Chicago, that's huge. And then they have a new point guard in Jeff Teague. Obviously, Paul George in Oklahoma City with Russell Westbrook, which looks like just a stopgap, one-year rental. But they're going to be much more interesting to follow. They're back in, on the NBA landscape again. So there are a handful of teams. Houston obviously heading Chris Paul to James Harden, how that's going to work. So, yeah, some wild moves here in the offseason. It's been fun. But in terms of shifting the balance of power, the Warriors bring everybody back. Kevin Durant was the MVP of the summer by taking a lot less than he could have gotten, and that allowed them to re-sign, obviously, Iguodala and Sean Livingston. Steph Curry signs long-term, so the Warriors are primed to do a repeat.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about why that Durant move is maybe the most significant one of the offseason, because really the Warriors could have been stripped down a little bit if not for Durant.
Well, what happens is, in terms of their ability to re-sign Livingston and especially Iguodala is the key to their bench. He almost is a starter, but he plays, off the bench. But Durant had to take, he had to take about, people thought he was going to take about $4 to $5 million less than he could have, take about $31 million. He actually ends up taking $25 million for next year. That's his salary. He made $26.5 this previous season. So what obviously you're seeing is he took a pay cut. And then by taking a pay cut, that allowed the cap space to open up for them to re-sign Iguodala and Sean Livingston. And those guys have been part of their core ever since they started to win titles. So Kevin Durant and Bob Myers, the GM, basically cited Kevin's unselfishness and the type of team player he was. And this is his way of kind of giving back and thanking them for bringing him in. And, this just shows you what kind of guy he is, and he had a tremendous finals. He was the finals MVP. And in this offseason, doing what he did in terms of the salary. And, he's not the first guy. I mean, Tim Duncan used to do this in San Antonio. But his was done a little bit later in his career where he would start taking a lot less money. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, I figured out Tim Duncan only made like $30 or $35 million. It was ridiculous because he kept on wanting to have the Spurs replenish their roster, and it paid off with his last title in 2014. Other stars don't do this. We saw Kobe Bryant. He was making $25, $26 million till the bitter end per year, and he wasn't into taking pay cuts. And when people talked about, he doesn't have anybody around him, one of the reasons was because Kobe was taking up so much to cap. So it takes a different type of guy to take a big-time pay cut, not make what you want, what you can get. And a lot of guys, frankly, feel like they deserve it, they should get it, and they don't want to, injuries could mess things up. But Durant kind of took the Duncan route this way.
Yeah, and obviously that keeps the Warriors way at the top of the list. Let's look at some of the other free agent storylines that you wrote about at Forbes.com. Mitch Lawrence is our guest. A lot of people wondering what the Kings' method to their madness is. They got a lot of young players. It seemed, they wanted to build a young team, and then they went out and got a couple of not just veterans, some really older veterans. You guys like Randolph and Vince Carter, and they brought in George Hill after they drafted a point guard. So what's the message of Sacramento?
Well, the message of Sacramento is, when you got 9 guys on the roster who are in their first or second year, you have to have veteran leaders who can teach these kids the ropes, especially if they've just been a losing situation. So they bring in Zach Randolph, who, the coach there is Dave Yeager. He coached in Memphis, so that's the connection with Zach Randolph and Vince Carter. These guys have played deep in the playoffs. They're pros. They've been around. They know how to teach guys the acceptable, how to be a professional basketball player. You can't cut corners. You have to do this, that. You have to, watch the nightlife. You have to take care of your body, et cetera, et cetera. All the things that they've adhered to have long careers. And then the George Hill move was a move where, they have a kid, De'Aaron Fox. Everybody knows he was one of the point guards taken right away. He went fifth. And the kid out of Kentucky, who a lot of people think might be the best point guard in the draft when all is said and done. And they brought in George Hill, who was a veteran, who was obviously in Utah last year, had a kind of a bad year in terms of injuries, but he's been around. He's played in some conference finals when he was starting for Indiana. And so Dave Yeager wanted a veteran to kind of teach De'Aaron Fox the ropes. So I kind of like what Sacramento did, because for so long they've been dysfunctional. What's the game plan been? And then they've had, obviously, DeMarcus Cousins, who was a headache as long as he was there. They finally had to get rid of him. So it looks like with Dave Yeager there, they are really starting to address their needs, going younger, but bringing in the guys who can teach, the veteran guys who can teach the young guys the ropes.
We're talking with Mitch Lawrence here, Sirius XM NBA Radio, covers the NBA for Forbes.com and the sporting news as well. What is your take, Mitch, on maybe they didn't add a free agent in L.A., but Chris Paul leaves, they bring back Blake Griffin. Are the Clippers still in the mix in that Western Conference? What was the message from Jerry West out there?
Well, I'm not sure what the message was from Jerry West, but I'll tell you, the message, this is an interesting thing, the Chris Paul divorce. Let's separate the playoffs from the regular season. Since Chris Paul arrived there in 2000, I think it was 2011, they had the greatest sustained success in their history in terms of the regular season. Now, we know in the playoffs it was a different story. Chris Paul could never get them out of the second round. And then, when Chris Paul is looking to do an extension, he wanted a fifth year where he was going to be, making $46 million when he was 38 years old. Now, I don't think it takes you to hire Jerry West to figure out that that's not a very good move financially. You just can't have people at that advanced stage making that kind of money. So Chris Paul was alerted to that, and he said, fine, you better trade me or I'm going to leave next year for Houston. He goes for Houston. So the big breakup that we all thought the Clippers were going to had to do because of this year after year of falling short in the playoffs, not getting out of the first round, whatever, that accounts for the Chris Paul move. Now, you got to remember something about L.A. That's a star-driven town. For people to go out there, you need to have stars on your team, and I think that had a lot to do with them bringing Blake Griffin back. That's one of those things. They had to do it. Yes, he has been injury-prone, but they still like him a lot. He's still a top player in their mind and a lot of people's minds. So that made sense. But this is going to be a different team because you're not going to see Chris Paul. You're not going to see J.J. Redick. Jamal Crawford's moved on. So they have gone from, a top four team in the West, maybe 4 or 5. They might be scrambling to be, 7th or 8th when all is said and done, because you just don't know what they're going to do at point guard. They got Patrick Beverley, the kid from Houston, who that was part of the Chris Paul deal. Teodosic is a player from Europe who a lot of people like, but some people say you have to be worried about him because, he doesn't, he's a guy who he hasn't been in the NBA. He doesn't know about playing in cultures in the NBA. And in Europe, he could be a bit of a prima donna. So we'll see how he works out. It could be a good kind of a backup signing. But they're going to be a much different team. I mean, the Clippers are not going to be the same without Chris Paul, and they're not going to be as good, without Chris Paul.
Hey, Mitch, how about another Paul George? Paul George and Russell Westbrook. How's this all going to end in OKC? And does that make them a top 4 team in the West?
Well, it definitely makes them better, makes them more intriguing. I just don't know if Paul George is going to be there beyond this year. He wants to be a Laker in the worst way. I think one of the reasons that he didn't get sent to Boston in the trade was because I don't think Boston felt that they could get his signature on an extension. And so I felt like they had to back off, and they weren't involved. I mean, it was a surprise move. It was supposed to be Boston or maybe Cleveland or the Lakers who were involved in the deal, and all of a sudden Oklahoma City comes in with this offer of Sabonis, Domantas Sabonis is a rookie, and then Victor Oladipo's got this 4 years left at about $84 million on his contract. He's overpaid, and so you could see with Oklahoma City, they're trying to keep Russell Westbrook happy. They're trying to, Russell Westbrook has a chance to sign long term. They obviously want to keep Paul George. but I don't think there's anybody in the league who really gives them much of a chance because Paul George has made it clear to everybody, especially, teammates, former teammates in Indiana, that he wants to be a Laker, and the Lakers would love to have him. So it's a bit of obviously a gamble by Oklahoma City, but they didn't have to give up that much to get him. And who knows how they'll be this year. I mean, they're going to be a factor. I mean, this year, last year was all Russell Westbrook and all the triple doubles and all that stuff. And this year, with Paul George, it'll be a much better team. Could there be a top 4 team after being 7th last year? We'll see. But it definitely, you have to keep your eye on Oklahoma City now.
Mitch Lawrence, Sirius XM NBA Radio. We're taking a look, kind of overview of the wild 2 weeks of free agency now that it's kind of slowed down a little bit here, but still a lot of crazy things could be still happening here where we just saw James Harden over the weekend with a huge contract there.
Right.
The Lakers have kind of been an interesting all-season story. Of course, the Summer League has got a lot of the young players on the showcase here, but let's shift over to the East here and kind of take a look at what Boston has done. Gordon Hayward is there now, but they had to move a lot of pieces out to make that work. So did Boston make a lateral move, or are they clearly better?
Well, they're somewhat better. I think it hurts them that they had to move Avery Bradley. I'm a big Avery Bradley guy. I think he's a really good two-way player, a very tough guy. And you saw when Isaiah Thomas went down, Avery Bradley stepped up there leadership-wise. And for them to have to give up that trade where they got Morris from Detroit, I think that's a setback for them. But obviously, they needed scoring. They needed a proven scorer, and Gordon Hayward's going to help them. He's not a big-time three-point shooter, we know that, but he's a guy who can get to the basket off the dribble, help you with the spacing, and so they're going to be better. They still have to add, obviously, a big or two for their rebounding. I don't think they're scaring Cleveland at this point, but they definitely have gotten better, and the big thing is they didn't get Jimmy Butler or Paul George. And I don't know if you can believe what's out there about what they offered for Paul George, or if you want to take it with a grain of salt. I tend not to believe any. I really don't know at this point. But it would have been a much better, much more successful offseason if they were able to get a Paul George with a Gordon Hayward. Then I think we'd all be excited about them really posing more of a threat to Cleveland. Now I think they'll still win, 53 games or so, 55. But I don't know how they're going to beat LeBron James as long as LeBron James is healthy with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love.
I just want to go back to the West for 1 minute here, guys. Mitch, your thoughts on where the T-Wolves are now, because that's a team that Mike and I have discussed a few times, and we'd certainly like to hear your thoughts on where Minnesota is now.
Well, the mandate has been set by ownership to Tom Thibodeau. It's time to start winning. And so they made a lot of moves. I mean, the Jimmy Butler trade was a great trade for him, reunited with Tom Thibodeau. That's a great thing for a coach to bring in. You always see coaches, if they go to new places, will sometimes bring in former players. And that's because they know that they can have these guys in the locker room sell their program for them. These veterans, these leaders will help make the transition. And I mean, Tom's been there a year, but obviously Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins are still adapting to him. And so he brings in Jimmy Butler, who's one of the top, 15 players in the league, a great two-way player. Plus, they're bringing Taj Gibson, who he had in Chicago. That helps. The weird thing, or the stranger move, I thought was the Jeff Teague move, because to me, he's not a Thibodeau player now. Tom's had success because of the Derrick Rose injury in Chicago when he had to deal with that all the time. He's had success getting point guards to play the way he wants them to play. But Jeff Teague is a kind of a offensive first player, doesn't play a lot of defense. So that doesn't actually fit with Tom. And what I had heard, too, was he was not really their first choice. My understanding was Kyle Lowry was their first choice. They opened up a lot of cap room for him, but that might have been a situation where the owner didn't want to pay luxury tax in Minnesota. And they were also kind of interested in George Hill, but I don't think they were kind of not a good match for each other at this stage of George's career. So they went with, and both Lowry and Hill, you have to remember, are 31. Jeff Teague's 29. Very good offensive player, so that makes him more dangerous. And then, Jamal Crawford, right? I mean, that's a great move for him off the bench, stretching the defense, coming in, giving them instant offense. So Minnesota, I think, will make the leap. I think I don't know if they're going to be a top 4 team, but they'll definitely be a playoff team if everyone stays healthy. And I just have to To me, although they have, Jimmy Butler, and that's great, and Thibodeau, to me it's all about Karl Anthony Towns because he's really the player for them who's going to lead them somewhere in the future. He and Andrew Wiggins have to get better defensively, and I think they're going to learn a lot this year from Jimmy Butler, how Tom Thibodeau wants to get that done.
We're chatting with Mitch Lawrence, Mitch_Lawrence on Twitter. Check out his piece at Forbes on the top free agent takeaways. We're going over some of the things here. You mentioned Kyle Lowry. It was almost like Toronto, because they gave that contract to DeRozan, they've come too far. It was almost like, let's just get the band back together. We'll be in the top 4, and we're okay with that.
Plus, you never know what LeBron's going to do after this coming season. I mean, that's got to be factor in, too. I mean, it's hard for teams to strip down, and especially a team that's won now 50 games for a couple of years in a row. A team that only really the problem is they can't get by LeBron James. I mean, this has happened 2 years in a row, once in the conference finals, last season, of course, in the semifinals. So they took a step back, but the problem for them is the matchup against LeBron. But I think the smart move by Masai Ujiri, the team president, was to bring everybody back, or at least bring Serge Ibaka back, bring Kyle Lowry back. They didn't bring P.J. Tucker back, but their core is back from the team from last year anyway. And obviously with that backcourt, things are still going to be looking up in Toronto. I think everybody, just like Boston and Washington, places like that, people are waiting to see with kind of bated breath this year what LeBron is going to do, because there are all these rumblings about him going to Los Angeles. Let me tell you something. If he leaves the East, it'll be, Toronto will have been smart to keep everybody together, because then they'll have a real shot with Boston and Washington to be the team to beat in the East.
Yep, everybody's kind of holding off to see what happens next year, and if LeBron ends up moving, as you've kind of hinted at in articles at Forbes. And
a long time.
Yep. And, we talked about that, and LeBron's just seemingly unhappy there in Cleveland, and we'll see what the next step is for them, because they haven't been able to do anything. Teams like Cleveland and Washington, another team that in the East that was a top final, into the final, a game away from getting into the finals, they haven't been able to improve either.
Well, they brought back Otto Porter. That was their big move. You could, disagree with that. I'm not sure how good Otto Porter is going to be, but they bought him back at obviously top dollar. What, about $105 million for a guy who's had, he's had one good breakout year last year, and then he tailed off in the playoffs. But getting back to LeBron, Cleveland was in a situation, guys. They didn't have any cap space. And they don't have a team president. We all know that. Dan Gilbert decided not to bring David Griffin back. He sent him on his way. LeBron wasn't happy about that. We know that from how he tweeted about how appreciative he was of David Griffin making the moves that obviously LeBron wanted him to make, and all that stuff, and being a key part of building a team that won the title last year. But, Cleveland just didn't have any cap space, and they don't have a lot of movable pieces. And so they're kind of stuck. They brought Korver back. They brought in Jose Calderon, who is a veteran guard, but man, he's not, he's defensive liability. And it's just like they have their big three still, and so that's where they still have it over everybody else in the East. But there are other parts you'd think they would have got younger on the wings and gotten, more athletic, and they brought Richard Jefferson back. So who knows? I mean, this is a team that, they wanted to get other players. Jimmy Butler was kind of interested in going there until he did a little investigation, and I think he got scared away in terms of getting traded there, because I don't think he knew what LeBron's future was. People are criticizing LeBron, by the way, for not recruiting free agents, but they just don't have any money. But in the end, they're still going to have to get some guys in to take less money on some veteran contracts, because they just have to improve their bench. They got to get better that way. But having said that, I mean, if you started the season tomorrow, they'd still be the favorite, right?
Cleveland, no question, right? I mean, I think that's everybody's kind of looking at Boston making this move, and I think the overwhelming answer is, Mitch, that they still haven't closed the gap enough on Cleveland. Well,
the problem is they still can't match up with LeBron, and they have trouble matching up with Kyrie. Those are the two guys, and I've said this for a long time. They're the best bailout shooters, that are in the East. They are the acknowledged stars, guys who can close games for you, winning games at the end of shot clocks. I don't know if Hayward will be that player for Boston, but these other teams don't have them. I mean, you talk about DeRozan and Lowry, John Wall, Bradley Beal, Isaiah Thomas, Gordon Hayward. they don't have the track record of Kyrie Irving and LeBron James. That really separates. That's what separates Cleveland from everybody else in the East. So, no, Boston gets a little bit better with Gordon Hayward. There's no doubt he can score a little bit better, but is he an elite player? No, he's not. He's an all-star type of player. He's not even, in my mind, he's not really an all-NBA player. He's a kind of a notch below. Very good player, all-star player. But in terms of, what is he going to do against Cleveland in the playoffs? Is he going to be a difference maker? Probably not.
Indiana, Chicago, Atlanta. Those were three Eastern Conference playoff teams last year. Would you say that there are three spots up for grabs in the East?
Oh, no doubt. And those are the three because they're all going to rebuild. I mean, we've seen Atlanta has had, Atlanta a couple of years ago won they went to the Eastern Finals. They won 60 games. Now nobody's back there from that team, obviously. And the last piece of that was Paul Millsap, and they got rid of him. And then you look at, obviously, Chicago because of the Butler move, and they're going to, at some point, they will buy out Dwayne Wade. It'll probably be around March when, you can do that later February, early March, so he can go play for a playoff team. There's no sense to have Dwayne Wade around if he's going to win you meaningless games that's going to affect your lottery chances. You don't want that. And Indiana without Paul George, they've done some reconfiguring, but they're going to be bad, and they probably need to, tank. I think the disappointing thing, if you're a Pacer fan, was with the Paul George trade, you didn't get any future picks or a future pick, and that's what you want. You're never going to get. You're going to lose those deals because that's the thing where you're never going to get close to equal value for a guy like Paul George because everybody knows that you're desperate to trade him, but you should try to at least get one draft pick or maybe send some bad contracts out, and they weren't able to accomplish either. So Indiana's going to be bad this year. So, yeah, this should open it up. We look at teams like, Detroit with Avery Bradley now, and after last year being such a bad season, after a playoff season, they'll be back in the hunt. Maybe Charlotte, with Dwight Howard could be in the hunt there for a playoff spot. Obviously, you have Miami last year just falling short of the playoffs after their great run. And then I know everybody in Philadelphia wants to talk about playoffs, but it's way too early. You just got to see what they have when they get on the floor. I'm not worried about Fultz spraining his ankle. That could happen to anybody. I know Brett Brown feels like he's kind of snake bit on the injury thing, but obviously we're all looking at Philadelphia. If they can roll Embiid out with Simmons, see what they have, and you know what, they might be an interesting team to look at as a kind of a playoff contender. But I wouldn't pencil them in for a playoff spot quite yet.
All right, Mitch Lawrence, check out the article at Forbes, Mitch_Lawrence, Sirius XM NBA Satellites Radio, and, of course, right here on the Sports Bash 97.3 ESPN with some good banter on the NBA, which we'll see what's next. Some Summer League games, which have been really intriguing, great crowds, a lot of excitement, and, of course, an injured Sixer. What else is new? Mitch, take care, pal.
Okay, guys, thanks.